a set built on reputation. Long before any camera rolled, the set of Rio Bravo carried its own quiet gravity. It was not loud, not theatrical, and certainly not chaotic. It was a place shaped by habit rather than hype, where people arrived knowing exactly where they stood without being told. Authority existed in the posture of the room itself, in the way conversations stayed measured and movements remained purposeful. No one needed to announce importance here. It had already been earned, long before this production began. This was a working environment governed by memory. Every light stand, every marked position on the floor felt informed by decades of repetition and unspoken agreement. Men who had survived the churn of Hollywood knew how fragile reputation could be and how slowly it was built. On this set, longevity mattered more than volume. Those who belonged understood the rhythms instinctively, and those who were new learned quickly by watching rather than asking. Hierarchy was present, but it was subtle. It lived in glances exchanged across the room, in who spoke first and who listened without protest. Decisions were rarely argued in public. Corrections, when needed, were brief and controlled. The culture rewarded restraint, and mistakes were handled quietly, without spectacle. This was not kindness exactly, but it was fairness rooted in experience. For outsiders, the atmosphere could feel intimidating without being hostile. The absence of noise created its own pressure. There was an expectation that everyone would carry themselves with a certain seriousness, not because anyone demanded it, but because the space itself seemed to require it. Careers had been made and broken under similar ceilings, and everyone present knew it. In such places, authority did not need reinforcement. It was assumed. It came from survival, from having lasted when others had not. Respect was less about titles and more about history. The set did not celebrate personalities. It honored consistency. Those who had proven themselves over time were granted space, and those who had not were expected to earn it quietly. This foundation mattered. It established the moral gravity of the environment long before anything went wrong. When rules exist without needing to be spoken, their violation carries greater weight. In a room built on discipline and memory, even a small fracture can resonate far beyond the moment itself, unsettling a balance that has taken years to achieve. Everyone present understood this instinctively, even if they could not have articulated it aloud. The set functioned like a quiet contract, binding people to standards older than any individual ego. It was precisely this silent agreement that would soon be tested, not by chaos, but by a moment of unexpected excess, and quietly remembered. The unwritten rules of old Hollywood. Old Hollywood operated on rules rarely written down, yet universally understood by those who lasted. Respect was not performative, and discipline was not theatrical. Authority moved quietly through rooms, expressed in timing, tone, and restraint rather than raised voices. To endure, one learned when to speak, when to wait, and when silence carried more weight than argument. These codes were not about fear or submission. They existed to protect the work, the people, and the fragile balance required to create something lasting. Seniority carried responsibility, not license. Those with power were expected to carry it carefully, aware that every action echoed far beyond the immediate moment. On disciplined sets, correction was meant to instruct, not to humiliate. A raised eyebrow often replaced a raised voice. Guidance was given privately whenever possible, preserving dignity on both sides. The goal was continuity, not conquest, and everyone understood that cruelty was a shortcut that eventually cost more than it gained. This understanding separated authority from dominance. Authority served the room, dominance served the self. One stabilized, the other disrupted. In old Hollywood, the difference mattered because productions depended on trust accumulated over time. A set functioned only when people believed the rules would be applied with consistency and proportion. Measured discipline also protected younger or less established figures without granting them immunity. Expectations were clear, but mercy existed within structure. Mistakes were addressed, then left behind. What lingered was not the error itself, but how it was handled and whether dignity survived the exchange intact. These unwritten rules created an environment where pressure was constant but rarely personal. Everyone felt the weight of standards, yet few felt singled out by them. It was a culture that valued endurance, patience, and mutual recognition over dominance displays, and it shaped how power was expected to behave. Because of this, any deviation stood out sharply, even when brief. When authority abandoned stewardship for impulse, the room noticed immediately, not with gasps or protests, but with a tightening silence that signaled something had shifted, and that the old balance might not correct itself without consequence. It was within this framework that expectations hardened quietly. People trusted that excess would be rare, and that when it appeared, it would be addressed with judgment rather than spectacle. This trust is what allowed strong personalities to coexist without constant conflict. It also meant that when a line was crossed, the impact traveled farther than the act itself, challenging the very code that held the room together, and forcing those who understood it best to decide whether silence alone would be enough to restore order. In moments like these, history does not announce itself. It waits, watching who will honor the tradition and who will test its limits, knowing that reputations forged over decades can be altered by a single, unguarded decision. Everyone present sensed that such decisions, once made, could not be fully taken back, only absorbed and answered. And the room remembered longer than people realized in those days quietly. A young man trying to belong. He was not reckless and he was not arrogant. He was simply young, standing inside a world that did not bend easily to new arrivals. The set carried a history older than his ambitions, and every movement he made felt visible in a way that unsettled him. He had learned his craft in fragments, in smaller rooms where mistakes were corrected loudly and forgiven quickly. This place was different. Here, nothing was corrected loudly, and nothing was forgotten easily. The pressure did not come from cruelty but from expectation. He knew he was being watched, not with suspicion but with appraisal. Every gesture mattered. Every pause carried meaning. He tried to match the calm around him, though it did not come naturally yet. His confidence was still under construction, built more on effort than certainty, and effort can sometimes overreach when silence feels heavy. His mistake, when it came, was small. It was the kind born of nerves rather than defiance, a moment where timing slipped or attention faltered. In another environment, it might have passed with a quiet correction or a brief reset. Here, it landed differently, amplified by the weight of the room and the standards it upheld. Not because it was unforgivable, but because it broke the invisible rhythm everyone else had learned to respect. He felt it immediately. The air shifted just enough for him to notice. No one rushed to his defense, and no one rushed to condemn him either. That absence was its own lesson. In a place governed by restraint, reaction was measured, and that waiting carried more meaning than any immediate response could have. He stood still, aware that whatever came next would matter far beyond the moment itself. What made him vulnerable was not the error, but his desire to belong. He wanted to prove he deserved the space he occupied, to show that he understood the rules even as he was still learning them. He did not resent the standards. He feared falling short of them in a room where falling short was rarely dramatized, only remembered. This perspective mattered. It kept the moment grounded in humanity rather than spectacle. He was not challenging authority or testing limits. He was navigating a narrow passage between expectation and inexperience, hoping to emerge unnoticed. Instead, his misstep placed him at the center of a moral environment far larger than he understood, one that would soon reveal how it treated those who stumbled without malice. The silence no one expected. What followed did not resemble confrontation. There was no raised voice, no sudden movement, no visible fracture of order. Instead, the set entered a quiet so complete it felt deliberate, as though the room itself had decided to pause. Conversation stopped mid-thought. Small adjustments ceased. Even the usual background motion seemed to withdraw, leaving behind a stillness that could not be mistaken for indifference. This silence was not confusion. It was recognition. Everyone present understood that something had shifted, and that reacting too quickly would only distort what had already happened. In environments built on discipline, silence often serves as a form of judgment, allowing actions to reveal their own weight without commentary. Here, the absence of noise carried more authority than any shouted correction ever could. No one rushed forward to restore order because order had not fully collapsed. It had only been unsettled. The pause allowed that reality to settle into the room. It gave space for reflection, for awareness, and for restraint to assert itself naturally. Those who had spent years navigating such spaces recognized this moment for what it was, a test of character disguised as inactivity. The young actor remained still, uncertain whether the quiet protected him or exposed him further. He could feel a tension without seeing it, a collective awareness that did not accuse yet did not absolve either. For the first time, he understood that silence could be heavier than rebuke, and that restraint could carry consequences without spectacle. Others noticed more than he did. They saw how authority responded when challenged not by rebellion but by circumstance. They watched to see whether excess would be compounded by further excess, or whether discipline would reassert itself through composure. In this waiting, reputations did not grow louder. They grew clearer. Silence in such rooms was never empty. It functioned as moral pressure, forcing individuals to sit with the implications of their actions without external distraction. It removed the comfort of immediate resolution and replaced it with awareness. Those unaccustomed to it often mistook it for weakness. Those who understood it recognized its strength. As the seconds stretched, the set remained intact but altered. The quiet did not demand response, yet it invited it. It left open the question of who would restore balance and how. In that unanswered space, the moment became larger than the incident itself, carrying forward into memory as something unfinished, waiting to be answered not by words, but by judgment exercised with care. Watching without performing. He had not moved when the silence arrived. Dean Martin remained where he was, neither advancing nor retreating, his posture unchanged. There was no visible signal that he intended to act, and that absence was itself a decision. In a room trained to notice everything, his stillness registered immediately. Dean had learned long ago that intervention performed too early often served the wrong purpose. It drew attention to the intervener rather than the imbalance itself. He understood that authority, when rushed, could look defensive, and defensiveness weakened whatever moral correction followed. So he watched, allowing the moment to fully reveal itself before shaping it. His gaze moved calmly, not searching for fault but reading the room. He measured faces, posture, and the subtle adjustments people made when they believed no one important was watching. This was not curiosity. It was assessment rooted in experience. He was less concerned with who had erred than with how the error now lived in the space. There was no impatience in him, only precision. He knew that ego demanded immediate response, while judgment benefited from delay. The silence gave him what he needed, clarity. It separated impulse from intention, reaction from consequence. In that separation, the true weight of the moment became visible. Others noticed his restraint. They recognized that his authority did not announce itself through command or movement. It existed quietly, like a stabilizing presence that did not require reinforcement. His refusal to perform reassured those who understood the code, reminding them that strength did not need to declare itself to be effective. The young actor did not yet understand this distinction, but he felt its effect. Dean's calm did not isolate him further, nor did it offer immediate comfort. Instead, it held the room steady, preventing the situation from tilting toward humiliation or escalation. That balance mattered more than intervention in that instant. By choosing to observe rather than act, Dean allowed responsibility to settle where it belonged. He gave the room time to absorb what had happened without forcing a narrative upon it. This was not passivity. It was control exercised quietly, a form of dominance that relied on awareness rather than force. And as the silence continued, it became clear that when he did move, it would not be to display authority, but to restore it. He understood that patience unsettled arrogance more effectively than confrontation ever could. Waiting denied impulse its stage and stripped excess of its audience. In that waiting, power reorganized itself quietly, away from ego and toward responsibility. Those watching sensed that the outcome would not hinge on speed, but on discernment. The longer he remained still, the more inevitable his eventual response felt. It would arrive without surprise, without flourish, and without appeal to emotion. It would simply realign the room to the standard it already claimed to honor. Nothing in his demeanor suggested urgency, only confidence that restraint, applied correctly, could guide the moment back into balance without damage or unnecessary loss of dignity. Watching without performing. He did not step forward when the room fell quiet. Dean Martin remained exactly where he was, posture relaxed, expression unchanged, as though the moment required nothing from him yet. On a set trained to notice shifts in energy, that stillness carried meaning. It suggested choice rather than hesitation, intention rather than absence. Dean understood that intervention, when rushed, often turned into performance. It shifted attention toward the person correcting instead of the imbalance itself. Years spent in controlled environments had taught him that timing mattered as much as action. Authority applied too quickly could appear defensive, and defensiveness weakened moral clarity. So he waited, allowing the silence to settle and reveal what words could not. His attention moved calmly through the room. He observed shoulders tightening, eyes lowering, small adjustments made by people suddenly aware of themselves. He was not searching for blame. He was measuring impact. What mattered to him was not who had erred, but how the error now lived among everyone present. There was no impatience in his restraint. Ego demanded immediacy, but judgment benefited from distance. The pause allowed impulse to separate from intention. In that space, consequences became clearer, stripped of emotional noise. Dean had learned that clarity arrived only when reaction was withheld long enough for truth to settle naturally. Others noticed his composure. They recognized authority that did not announce itself, power that did not need movement to be felt. His refusal to perform reassured those who understood the old code. Strength, in this form, relied on awareness rather than volume or display. The young actor sensed this without fully understanding it. Dean's stillness neither condemned nor rescued him. Instead, it held the room steady, preventing the moment from tipping toward humiliation. That balance protected more than pride. It protected the culture the room depended on. By choosing observation over display, Dean allowed responsibility to rest where it belonged. He did not force resolution or assign narrative. He trusted the room to absorb the moment fully. This was not passivity. It was control exercised quietly, dominance expressed through restraint. As the silence continued, something subtle shifted. Waiting denied arrogance its audience and stripped excess of momentum. Power reorganized itself without instruction. Those watching sensed that when Dean finally acted, it would not be dramatic. It would be precise, corrective, and final, restoring the standard the room already claimed to honor. Why immediate reaction would have failed? An immediate response would have satisfied instinct, not judgment. In rooms governed by legacy and restraint, speed often belongs to ego rather than clarity. A sharp correction in that moment would have transformed a contained imbalance into a public contest, forcing sides to form before understanding had time to settle. What appeared decisive could have quickly become destructive. Had authority moved too quickly, it would have invited resistance, even from those who privately recognized the misstep. Public reactions tend to harden positions because once a moment becomes performative, retreat feels like defeat. The issue would no longer have been about proportion or standards, but about saving face. In such environments, pride escalates faster than truth. Immediate reaction also would have collapsed nuance. It would have reduced a complex human moment into a simple act of blame, denying everyone the opportunity to absorb what had actually occurred. Patience allowed the room to recognize the imbalance on its own terms. That recognition carried more permanence than any forced correction could have achieved. There was also the matter of protection. Swift intervention might have appeared to defend one individual at the expense of the larger code. That would have weakened the very structure meant to ensure fairness. Restraint ensured that no one was publicly elevated or diminished prematurely. It preserved dignity on all sides, even while accountability quietly took shape. Patience in this context was not inaction. It was strategy. It allowed emotion to dissipate before it could infect judgment. It prevented the moment from becoming a spectacle remembered for its volume rather than its resolution. By delaying response, authority retained flexibility. It could choose the correct action instead of the fastest one. Those accustomed to loud power often mistake waiting for weakness. In disciplined environments, waiting is a form of control. It removes urgency from the equation and forces truth to surface without pressure. The silence denied impulse its reward and stripped excess of momentum. As time passed, the room recalibrated itself. People adjusted without instruction. Awareness replaced reaction. This shift could not have occurred under the weight of an immediate response. It required space to unfold naturally. In the end, restraint proved stronger than speed. It preserved the integrity of the environment while preparing it for correction that would be accepted rather than resisted. The lesson was clear, even if unspoken. Power exercised too quickly often damages what it intends to protect, while power that waits gains the authority to restore balance without leaving scars. The quiet realignment of power. Nothing was announced, yet everything began to change. The room did not reset itself with instruction or gesture, but with awareness. Conversations resumed carefully, not as they had been before, but adjusted, as though everyone now carried a clearer understanding of the line that had briefly been crossed. Authority did not reassert itself through command. It recalibrated through behavior. What mattered most was what did not happen. There was no public correction, no explanation offered to satisfy curiosity. By withholding theater, the moment was allowed to remain proportionate. It stayed contained, free from the exaggeration that often distorts memory. Truth, left undressed by performance, settled into the space more firmly than spectacle ever could. The young actor felt the shift first. He was no longer standing alone inside the silence. Subtle signals told him as much. A glance that lingered longer than before, a presence nearby that had not been there moments earlier. Nothing overt, nothing reassuring in words, yet enough to let him know that isolation had lifted. He had not been absolved, but neither had he been marked. Others adjusted as well. Authority figures softened their posture without surrendering it. The imbalance corrected itself through alignment rather than enforcement. The room began to function again, not by erasing what had happened, but by absorbing it. That absorption carried more permanence than a reprimand ever could. Dean Martin did not claim credit for this shift. He did not need to. His earlier restraint had already shaped the outcome. By refusing to intervene publicly, he allowed the room to find its own equilibrium under the weight of shared standards. Power, redistributed quietly, became less about hierarchy and more about responsibility. This was the moral response unfolding in real time. It did not rely on humiliation or declaration. It relied on trust in the culture itself. The absence of spectacle prevented defensiveness, allowing people to adjust without feeling diminished. Correction arrived without resistance because it did not demand acknowledgement. In this recalibration, authority regained its legitimacy. It demonstrated that strength could correct without dominating, that leadership could guide without exposing. The young actor, now integrated back into the rhythm of the set, carried the lesson forward without needing it explained. He had seen how power behaved when it respected its own limits. The room continued its work, outwardly unchanged yet internally aligned. What had been tested was not discipline, but character. And character, when exercised with restraint, had proven capable of restoring balance quietly. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone understood that something important had occurred, and that it had been handled without damage, without noise, and without the need for anyone to stand at the center of the story. When arrogance finds no audience, arrogance depends on reaction. It draws strength from opposition as much as from agreement, feeding on any response that confirms its presence. When neither arrives, it begins to thin, losing definition without ever being confronted. On the set, this is exactly what happened. The moment passed without validation or challenge, and in that absence, excess had nowhere to stand. The authority figure at the center of the earlier imbalance was not corrected publicly, nor was he defended. He was simply met with composure. That composure offered no mirror for his impulse to reflect against. Without resistance to push back on or approval to reinforce him, the posture he had assumed could not sustain itself. It softened naturally, not because he was forced to retreat, but because there was no terrain left to occupy. This is how arrogance often collapses in disciplined spaces, not through exposure but through irrelevance. When a room refuses to amplify it, arrogance loses its urgency. It becomes smaller, quieter, easier to leave behind without explanation. The absence of audience denies it purpose. Crucially, this process preserved dignity. The authority figure was not stripped of position or publicly corrected. He was allowed to recalibrate without humiliation. That restraint protected the individual while correcting the behavior. It ensured that the lesson landed without breeding resentment or defensiveness, both of which would have outlived the moment itself. Others in the room recognized this immediately. They saw that power had not been wrestled away, only redirected. The environment did not punish excess, it absorbed and neutralized it. That distinction mattered. It reinforced the idea that justice did not require spectacle to be effective. The young actor observed this quietly. He did not see a victory or a defeat, only a restoration of balance. The absence of confrontation spared him from becoming collateral damage in a struggle that was never about him to begin with. What he witnessed instead was a culture correcting itself without demanding witnesses. In this way, authority lost ground without losing face. It learned without being lectured. The room moved forward without scars. Arrogance, denied its audience, faded into memory rather than conflict. The correction was complete not because it was loud, but because it was final in its quietness. Nothing more was needed. What was never said, but understood. No one gathered the room. No explanation followed. The moment was allowed to pass without commentary, and that restraint carried its own clarity. In spaces shaped by tradition, lessons rarely arrive through instruction. They arrive through contrast, through the quiet recognition of what occurred and how it was resolved. Nothing needed to be named for everyone to understand it. The absence of a lecture prevented defensiveness. The absence of an apology avoided performance. What remained was awareness, shared and unspoken. People adjusted their behavior not because they were told to, but because the standard had been reaffirmed without declaration. This is how culture corrects itself when it is healthy. It does not rely on force or repetition. It relies on example. Those present had witnessed how excess was met with restraint, how imbalance was addressed without humiliation, and how authority preserved itself by honoring its limits. That example lingered longer than any reprimand would have. The authority figure at the center of the earlier moment understood this as well. Without being confronted, he was given space to recognize the boundary he had crossed. The lack of public correction offered him dignity, but it also removed any ambiguity about expectations going forward. What would not happen again required no explanation. Others absorbed the lesson in their own way, some through relief, some through reflection, some through renewed confidence in the environment they worked within. The young actor especially carried the understanding forward. He did not receive reassurance in words, yet he felt the difference in how the room held him afterward. The culture had spoken without speaking. What made this transmission effective was its subtlety. Direct correction often fixes behavior while leaving attitudes untouched. Indirect correction reshapes understanding itself. By seeing restraint modeled rather than demanded, people internalized it. They recognized that the rules were not arbitrary and that they would be upheld without spectacle. This method also protected continuity. Productions depend on forward motion, not lingering conflict. By allowing the lesson to settle quietly, the work continued uninterrupted. The moment became part of the set's memory rather than its disruption, a reference point rather than a wound. In this way, what was never said became the most enduring message. Everyone present understood the boundary, the expectation, and the standard. They knew what conduct belonged in the room and what did not. No record was made, yet the understanding held. Culture, after all, is not enforced through announcements. It is maintained through behavior repeated consistently and corrected thoughtfully. In that quiet aftermath, the room confirmed its values without raising its voice. The lesson endured precisely because it had not been declared. The young actor's unseen gift. What the young actor carried away from that day was not relief, and it was not protection. No one stepped in to shield him publicly, no voice rose to frame him as a victim, and no gesture singled him out as fragile. Instead, he was given something quieter and far more durable, a living example of how power behaves when it is disciplined by conscience. At first, he may not have recognized it as a gift at all. In the immediate aftermath, there were no affirming words to cling to, no clear signal that the moment had resolved in his favor. Yet as time passed, the meaning of what he had witnessed began to settle. He had seen authority exercised without cruelty, correction without humiliation, and leadership without performance. These were lessons rarely taught directly and almost never explained. The experience reframed his understanding of strength. He learned that composure could redirect a room more effectively than confrontation, and that silence, when chosen deliberately, could protect dignity on all sides. He saw that restraint was not weakness, but confidence refined by experience. These observations lodged themselves deeper than reassurance ever could. Because he was not rescued publicly, he was not diminished. The absence of spectacle preserved his standing and allowed him to remain part of the rhythm of the set. He continued his work without the burden of having been singled out, yet with a heightened awareness of the standards that governed the space. The culture did not break him down, it invited him to grow into it. This is how formative moments often arrive. They do not announce themselves as lessons. They present themselves as experiences that demand interpretation. The young actor left that day with an expanded sense of what leadership looked like, and with a clearer understanding of the kind of professional he might one day become. What could have hardened into embarrassment instead matured into perspective. The incident did not define him as someone who failed, but as someone who learned. He witnessed that mistakes could exist within a system that valued correction over punishment and dignity over dominance. Years later, he would likely remember less about the mistake itself and more about the atmosphere that followed. He would recall how the room held together, how authority adjusted rather than exploded, and how leadership revealed itself through patience. That unseen gift shaped not just his confidence, but his character, turning a moment of vulnerability into quiet instruction that endured long after the set moved on. Reflection, power that doesn't need to prove itself. In the end, nothing about that day demanded to be remembered loudly. There was no defining confrontation, no dramatic turning point preserved through repetition. And yet, the moment endured precisely because of its restraint. It revealed something older and steadier than reaction, a model of power that did not require proof to be real. Authority, when exercised with confidence rather than insecurity, rarely announces itself. It moves through rooms quietly, shaping outcomes without demanding recognition. What unfolded on that set reflected a deeper truth about leadership and legacy. Power rooted in dignity does not escalate tension, it absorbs it. It does not rush to correct, it waits until correction will last. This distinction matters beyond Hollywood, beyond hierarchy, beyond that single afternoon. Many people carry some form of authority in their lives, whether visible or subtle. It exists in families, workplaces, friendships, and moments when influence outweighs position. The question is rarely whether power is present, but how it is used when tested. The example left behind that day offered reassurance. It suggested that restraint could guide outcomes more effectively than force, and that silence, when chosen deliberately, could preserve humanity without surrendering standards. No one needed to win for balance to be restored. No one needed to lose for accountability to exist. Legacy is built this way, not through moments that dominate attention, but through patterns that shape memory. Those who witnessed the incident carried forward a renewed confidence in the culture they belonged to. They saw that excess could be corrected without cruelty, and that dignity could survive pressure intact. For the audience, the reflection lands quietly. It asks nothing directly, yet invites consideration. How often is reaction mistaken for strength? How often does speed replace judgment? And how often could patience, applied with intention, prevent harm before it takes root? The calm resolution of that moment reminds us that power does not need to prove itself through noise or display. Its truest expression is consistency, discernment, and restraint. When authority understands its limits, it becomes trustworthy. When it honors dignity, it builds loyalty. And when it chooses silence over spectacle, it leaves behind something far more enduring than a reaction, a standard worth remembering, and a model worth carrying forward into whatever rooms we ourselves one day shape.